Remakes or slop? You should probably stop asking for them. When I looked at the Star Fox 64 remake on Switch 2 a couple of months ago when it was announced, I couldn't have felt any emptier watching a franchise that I loved so deeply be repackaged for a new generation and have it look so bland and unappealing. And for Star Fox fans, I'm sure there was a lot of bittersweet feelings seeing that announcement because on the one hand, seeing that series be revived after a game like Star Fox Zero, which was so disappointing way back in, gosh, I guess 2016 or 17 or so. It's been almost 10 years since that Wii U flop, but finally seeing it revived, that franchise revived for a new system was so exhilarating when I first saw it pop up on my YouTube feed that they had released a brand new game. And then when you finally look inside and realize it was just another Star Fox 64 remake, that excitement was so deflating. And it was paired with the Ocarina of Time remake as well. And seeing that those two games be reheated and repackaged again, it was, I can't say disheartening because I don't care that much, but or at least not to that level, but it wasn't fun to see. It's frustrating just how these big companies at Nintendo, Sony, Xbox are so willing to let the history of the great games that they've made fade away to the sands of time in favor of repackaging nostalgia for a quick buck. And when I look at the Star Fox 64 remake in particular, it just doesn't appeal to me anymore. And the reason I say that is because the visuals, outside of the character redesigns, which were obviously done styled after the old puppet designs from the SNES game, which was one of the few artistic choices they made that I thought was interesting. Everything else, with the way that the original 64 level design and architecture and modeling was redone on Switch 2, sure, it looks on a technical level much more detailed and grittier and all that good stuff, but when I was looking at it hard, I just felt it looked like any other modern game. It looked like anything else that you could spit out in Unreal Engine. And when I saw that was the direction that Nintendo wanted to go with Star Fox visually, it was disappointing because the original 64 game was so clear with its level design, partly because of the low poly requirements of the N64, but they really made a lot of creative decisions that packed a lot of punch because of those constraints on the hardware. And as a result, the level design and the enemy placement and colors used were done to make things very clear to the player. And you lose a lot of that readability in the new game. Looking at the Corneria stage, it gets so dark in some parts where you can barely see what's happening, and that just didn't happen on the original 64 version. And this really leads to me, I'm getting really tired of these remakes of classic games because they are a refusal to acknowledge the original releases as a work of art that shouldn't be messed with, and when you bring up the concept of video games as art, and I think one of the reasons that video games aren't taken as seriously as an artistic medium is the player base for all of these big franchises constantly clamoring for remakes of old games. I'm sure many people saw this when Silent Hill 2 remake released a couple of years ago. A lot of people just refused to play the PS2 original because they just felt like playing the remake instead. They felt that a modernized version of that landmark release for the gaming space was preferable, and I just don't agree. Silent Hill 2 in particular, the way that it was structured with that over-the-shoulder camera with some fixed camera elements in there, and the grittier aesthetic required by the PS2 hardware and the way it rendered certain things, as well as the way the story was told, was very specific to that piece. And to go back and to try and say that you can do it better is so asinine to me. It would be like saying Huckleberry Finn is not good enough for a modern audience, that the way Mark Twain wrote it was simply incongruent with the tastes of a modern audience. And so, I would imagine that if somebody were to try and remake one of the greatest American novels of all time, that they would say, well, maybe the characters shouldn't speak the way that they do in the original. Maybe we need to take out the N-word, or take out the way certain characters talk, because that might be offensive to people nowadays. Or even just making the prose slightly blander so as to make it a little easier to follow. Even though Mark Twain, not the hardest guy to follow. This isn't Dostoevsky or anything. But it'd be like trying to do that and making a Huckleberry Finn 2 or a Huckleberry Finn Kindle edition or something, and pretending like it's the new definitive replacement for the original work. You just don't see that kind of language being tossed around in other mediums. No one's going around and saying that The Godfather needs a remake and that they want a remake for their modern hardware to watch a movie. And I know video games and movies and TV shows and literature are different mediums, and fundamentally a video game is a computer program that can be run better on different hardware, which is why the analogy isn't as clean as I would like. But to say that these older games, with their technical flaws and all on their original hardware, are simply insufficient for today's audiences, I just think that's crazy. You can still go back and play the original Star Fox 64 on the original 64, and it's still a perfectly playable game. Not just perfectly playable, but it's still enjoyable. And the creative decisions, for example, the dialogue in the original compared to the remake in 2026, they actually are significant. The lines in the original are much punchier. They're much more direct and to the point. It gets the personality of each individual character across so much more concisely, and to be frank, in a much more appealing and charming way than the new one. The Switch 2 release, it's filled with this corny, slow-paced, very obvious, dry dialogue, and no amount of lore tidbits or extra characterization between stages is really going to entice me to like it over the original, first of all, and particularly view it as a replacement of the original, because they're not. They're completely different. I think if games want to be taken seriously as an art form, these original releases need to be taken seriously as worthy of standing the test of time. And Ocarina of Time is one of those games that's now being remade, and God only knows what they're going to do with it this time around. And I say this as someone who grew up with the 3DS remake. So many lighting differences that changed the mood of a dungeon, particularly with the removal of fog. The Forest Temple was completely changed because of the lack of fog, and all of its 64 simpleness in the geometry of the level is laid bare for people to see when there's no fog, and it removes a lot of the moodiness of the original game. And of course, the 3DS release was based off the 1.2 cartridge, where the blood was removed in favor of either being completely eliminated, or Ganondorf's coughs at the end of the game become green puke instead of coughing blood. The final boss was also completely changed lighting-wise and removes the dark, imposing atmosphere that Ganon brought in the original game. And in the 3DS release, it was completely over-brightened and still looked cool, but, no amount of added geometry to the characters is going to remove the loss of that atmosphere. And, I just don't view remakes as replacements for original games. And I'd also like to point out that I think there are diminishing returns with remakes and with begging for more and more releases for your favorite franchises. I think that for a couple of series in particular, there's only so many iterations you can make on a core idea before it runs its course and you kind of need to move on to something else. I think a great example of this would be the original Spyro the Dragon trilogy. Insomniac themselves admitted that by the time that they got to the third game, they were tossing in completely new characters with different gameplay styles to Spyro because they simply didn't know how much more they could do with the simpler collectathon format that Spyro 1 had introduced. And I think that's what you get when your ideas run their course. I think Star Fox, again, is a big culprit in this. You take Star Fox 64 as a concept, and there's so many players that were fans of the original 64 game that were frustrated when Star Fox Adventures came around and was a Zelda clone, and were also frustrated with Assault because it didn't go far enough into the traditional on-rail space shooter format. And to people who feel that way, I would just say, how much more variation are you going to get with the space shooter, with the on-rail shooter? The only thing I can think of is maybe going the way of, say, Panzer Dragoon, where you are able to hit targets on your side and behind you, and you have a more three-dimensional play space with the on-rails format, as well as maybe upgrading your ship halfway through the level, stuff like that. There's things you can do to spice it up, but at the end of the day, there's only so much you can really do with an on-rail shooter before it starts to go stale. There's a big reason why shoot-'em-ups don't usually last past their second release. It's because there's only so many bullet hells you can put your player through before they've kind of seen the whole game. And remakes, it seems to me that major publishers have viewed remakes as a way to substitute having to iterate on a series that already exists, because you can go back to the roots of said franchise and pretend that you're introducing that already stale series to a new audience with a brand new coat of paint, and you're doing that by taking the stuff that people liked in the original and repackaging it into what the publisher thinks the modern audience wants, by morphing it into whatever the current standards of the day are. So, what would I do instead of asking for a remake? If, in my view, a remake is taking an original piece of art and putting it through a blender to compact it down to something that a company thinks is palatable to the players of today, that will make them a quick buck to bank off of nostalgia. If that's how I view remakes, then what should we be doing instead? Well, I am shocked that not enough people are really pushing these major companies to re-release their back catalog through their digital storefronts. And I know there's a lot of discussion on digital storefronts right now, and the slow apocalypse of physical media, especially after Sony will be discontinuing discs on PlayStation 5 and beyond, starting in 2028. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But we should be pushing these publishers to re-release their old games at an affordable price so that they can be preserved forever, particularly if they're DRM free, which, companies like Nintendo and Sony probably wouldn't be game for. But ideally, if you could get a DRM free ROM of Ocarina of Time or Star Fox 64 and make it available to the public for a reasonable price, then those games would be preserved forever. These physical cartridges do have a lifespan. Their batteries, their interior batteries that hold your save data, have a time limit on them. They will go bad. You will need to replace them eventually, and you will lose all of your save data when you do so. And discs, of course, discs have a lifespan as well. There's disc rot. So if you live in a house that is incredibly humid, or you happen to be a household that has a smoker in it or whatever, those damages can lead to disc rot and make certain sections of the disc completely unreadable, including, deep scratches as well. Physical media has a time limit on it as well. But having a digital copy that you can boot up in 2026 or 2086, assuming we're all here by then, is the best way to preserve the history of gaming. It is the most practical way to do so. It's the way that you can get games into the hands of the most players. And it's frankly asinine that not enough companies are really doing this. It seems to me that they don't think there's really much market in it. And they seem to be pretty intent on having people not own anything. Again, alluding back to Sony's recent decision over the last week. So now more than ever, we're really at risk of losing the cultural significance that some of these games had. GoldenEye 007, just off of the top of my head, is one of these key releases where GoldenEye was completely revolutionary in the 5th generation of consoles with its multiplayer, its difficulty, structured missions, the raw game design that held it all together, and it being generally likable as a legacy Rareware title. It was huge in the late 90s, and then once the N64 went out of print and the GameCube started and so on, and Rareware left Nintendo and became a Microsoft property, we slowly lost touch with GoldenEye 007 as a cultural impact. And as a result, young people don't know about GoldenEye 007. They know about Fortnite. And that's a shame, because there are plenty of old school mechanics that made their way to third person shooter battle royales. It's a foundational piece of gaming history, and Nintendo tried to re-release it again on NSO, on Nintendo Switch Online, a couple of years ago, and I applaud them for actually getting it on the service. But you can't buy 007 on Switch right now. It's only available as a rented copy so long as you have the subscription to NSO. So, Nintendo's $20 ransom fee to be able to connect your games online and play online. So, and you have to actually, I think it's still like $55 or $60 to pay for the N64 expansion pack to play the N64 games that are offered on NSO. So yeah, for like $60 a year, you get the opportunity to rent one of the most important games of an entire generation of gaming consoles. Jet Set Radio, another game, defining game of the early 2000s aesthetically, with the graffiti and the cell shading and the art style of the characters. So many artists changed their art style to include influences from Jet Set Radio. People still talk about Jet Set Radio today because of how the music and the art style was so crucial to its appeal. And it, despite the game itself being a little archaic in certain respects. And you used to be able to buy Jet Set Radio with a PC remake that Sega had put out on Steam. You can't anymore. It's delisted now. And that's one game that will be lost to the sands of time now. And, you used to be able to do this. Sega used to be better with this as well, with Genesis games that were included in the bundle that you could buy in bulk. Now you can't do that anymore. They're almost all delisted. Same thing with the Dreamcast. There were a ton of key Dreamcast games that were available on PC, including Jet Set Radio, that are almost all delisted as well, with the sole exception being Sonic Adventure 2 and Sonic Adventure 2 Battle, and SA1 or SADX as well. Tons of Dreamcast games completely delisted already. And you can bet your ass that those will be delisted. Any that you find on Steam that you can still scrounge up together from these big companies having their back catalogs up on Steam or on their own storefronts, you can bet that they're gonna disappear the instant another one of these remakes pops up. Another instance where their motivation to drum up a quick buck by bringing together some old gamers' nostalgia to go buy a remake. You can bet when that remake comes out, that old game, gone. Even games from the mid-2010s aren't safe. The original Sonic Generations, its original PC release on Steam, was delisted when Shadow Generations dropped a couple of years ago, and it was packaged with a Sonic Generations remake or re-release or reimagine, or however you want to put it, which included a lot of scripting changes. It included the voicing changes as well, if I remember correctly. And it's just not the same game. So what are we really asking for when we ask for a remake? And this is really the point of the video. I find remakes to be detrimental to the series that they are allegedly remaking. I think they prey upon players' nostalgia for a quick buck, when in many cases they simply do not replace the game that they originally set out to remake. I think the fact that so many developers view remakes as a way to improve upon and change an old game to modern sensibilities is cuts directly against the grain of trying to view video games as a legitimate art form. I think original games should be left in the state that they are in and should be re-released if they're going to be re-released, which they should. As a matter of preservation, we should have good ports up on digital storefronts, hopefully free of DRM, so that we can be able to enjoy the games for many years to come without relying on without solely relying on physical medium. And as a final aside, when you ask for a remake, what are you actually asking for? Are you just desperate for a new game in a series that's probably run its course a little bit? Or are you just unwilling to interact with something older than the PS4? Because if you're just unwilling to interact with something older than the PS4 or Xbox One generation, then I'd invite you to maybe give some of these older games a shot, because you'd be surprised on how much game design in modern generations were built in the 6th, 7th, 5th generation of consoles, and how fun many of them still remain, and how complete many of them were without having to have dozens of gigabytes of updates and microtransactions and things like that. As somebody who loves retro gaming, I think a lot of these older games, just to be frank, were kind of better, you know? And these remakes kind of make it evident just how soulless many of them can be when put through the modern meat grinder of the gaming industry. But I hope some of what I'm saying has made sense, and I hope that I've been able to articulate something that I've been feeling for a long time. I'm getting pretty darn sick of the culture that we live in being in a constant loop every 20 years where nostalgia is constantly drummed up because developers are so damn scared to just make something new. I'm really, really tired of it. I'm tired of all my movies being rehashes of superhero movies. I'm tired of all my music just trying to think about better days. And I'm most tired of all of the video games that I grew up playing that I am now old enough now to see those games be repackaged into slop. I'm tired of it. And if you're tired of it, I would encourage you to either push these companies to not put physical media in an early grave. I would push these companies to actually release their back catalog of industry-defining great games, and even the ones that weren't great, for the sake of gaming history and for the sake of being able to play our old games and actually own them. I would be pushing these publishers to actually release their stuff on digital storefronts or keep their new releases having a physical option. That's what I would do. Or you could just do what I do and just keep playing retro games. keep emulating your back catalog and be able to play games the way they used to be played. So those are my thoughts. I know I ranted quite a bit, but I hope what I'm saying makes sense, and I hope I'm able to edit this down to a way that is much more palatable. I know it's a bit of a different style video. I didn't really have a script for this. This is more my thoughts and me ranting at the camera. But I appreciate all of you for watching, and I will be back soon with more content. So thank you much.